On a July morning in 1994 in Callaway County, Missouri, a man named Chester Aldrin stood at his fence line and watched his neighbor's problem get worse for the 14th day in a row. The problem was a stump. Not just any stump. The oak tree that had stood in the center of what was now the Deer Creek Estates construction site had been 300 years old when they cut it down 6 weeks earlier. 300 years of root growth. 300 years of a living thing deciding that this particular piece of Missouri clay was where it belonged and would always belong. The trunk had been 8 feet across at the base. The root system spread 40 feet in every direction, thick as telephone poles near the center, branching and rebranching into thousands of smaller roots that gripped the earth like the fingers of something that had no intention of letting go. What remained after the tree itself was gone was a stump that had now defeated in sequence and with what appeared to Chester to be a certain quiet satisfaction. 1 Caterpillar 350, Excavator 2, Caterpillar D8 bulldozers working in tandem, a winch system rated for 50 tons, and the combined expertise of everyone Bryce Mercer had been able to reach by telephone in the state of Missouri. Chester had watched all of this from his fence line. He had watched it without comment, without amusement, and without the slightest impulse to go over and say anything. He had simply watched and waited, and continued doing the work of his own farm, which had a rhythm to it that 14 days of construction chaos on the neighboring property had not disrupted in any meaningful way. He was 71 years old. He had been farming these 320 acres for 45 years. He had seen most things worth seeing in rural Missouri, and what he had not seen he had heard about from men who had, and what he had heard about had taught him the same thing that the seeing had taught him, which was that there was almost always a moment in every difficult situation when the people involved finally became ready to hear a different kind of answer than the one they had been chasing. That moment had not yet arrived at the Deer Creek Estates construction site, but Chester knew it was coming. He could read it in the way the crew moved around the stump each morning slower and with less confidence than the day before. He could read it in the way Bryce Mercer himself stood looking at the thing, arms crossed, the body language of a man whose certainty had been replaced by something he was not accustomed to feeling and did not have good words for. Chester was in no hurry. He had other things to attend to. Now let me tell you about Chester Aldrin before we go any further, because the man matters as much as the machine in this story, and you cannot understand either one without understanding where both of them came from. Chester was born in 1923 on the same land he was still farming in 1994. His father, Emmett Aldrin, had bought those 320 acres in 1921, 2 years before Chester arrived, and had spent the next several decades turning what had been scrub timber and worn-out pasture into ground that would grow corn and soybeans and support a family through the years when supporting a family required everything a piece of ground had to give, and sometimes more than that. Emmett Aldrin was not a man who talked a great deal. He was a man who worked, and he communicated most of what he knew through the act of working, which meant that Chester's education had been largely conducted in fields and barns and fence lines rather than in classrooms, and what Chester had learned in those settings had stayed with him in the specific and irreplaceable way that knowledge stays with you when you received it from a person who was demonstrating it at the same time. In 1932, when Chester was 9 years old, Emmett Aldrin made the most consequential purchase of his life. The Caterpillar 20-crawler tractor had been manufactured in 1930. By the time Emmett acquired it, used in the deepest year of the Great Depression, It was already 2 years old and had the marks to show it. $800. That was what Emmett paid. In 1932, $800 was not a price. It was a statement. It was everything the Aldrin family had managed to save across years of careful and often grinding work transferred in a single transaction to a machine that Emmett had decided he needed. The men at the feed store in Fulton heard about it the way men at feed stores always heard about things, and they had opinions. One of them said, "Emmett, you spent everything you've got on a machine that old Emmett had," looked at the man with the expression he used when he was not going to say more than was necessary. He said, "This machine was built for stubborn, and I've got nothing ahead of me but stubborn work." That was the end of the conversation as far as Emmett was concerned. The Caterpillar 20 weighed about 5,000 pounds. Its engine made perhaps 25 horsepower at the drawbar, which was a modest number even by the standards of 1930. It was not the largest machine in Callaway County. It was not the most powerful. It could not do what a modern excavator could do, and it could not do it quickly, and it did not try. What it could do was pull, that was what it had been designed for in the specific and intentional way that machines from that era were often designed not for versatility and not for spectacle, but for the performance of one particular task under the full range of conditions that task might present. The Caterpillar 20 had been built to pull plows through heavy soil, to pull stumps out of fields being cleared for crops, to pull loads that horses could not manage and men could not budge. It had been built without a hydraulic pressure limit, without a sensor system, without a safety shutoff that would interrupt the pull when the load exceeded a calculated threshold. It either pulled until whatever it was pulling gave way, or it kept pulling until something in itself gave way, and Emmett had made sure over 20 years of use that nothing in the machine was going to give way before the roots did. Chester had grown up watching his father work that machine. He had watched it for 35 years from the age of 9 until Emmett died in 1967, and in those 35 years he had absorbed the knowledge of how to use it, the way you absorb knowledge when you receive it in the field from a man who has spent years developing it, not as theory, as fact, as the specific understanding of what a machine built for one purpose could accomplish when you applied it correctly at the right angle with the right rigging in the right sequence. When Emmett died, Chester continued, he had no reason to change what was working. He kept the Caterpillar 20 in the same barn where Emmett had parked it after each use. He started the engine once a month regardless of whether he had work for it because Emmett had done that too, and Chester understood why without needing to say it out loud. A machine that is not kept running is not waiting, it is dying. And Chester had no interest in letting this particular machine die. He used it several times a year for jobs on his own farm that nothing else could handle quite as well. A stump at the edge of a field that needed to come out before he could run equipment through, a fence post so deep in clay that the post pounder alone would never touch it. Jobs where the combination of applied physics and patient steady force was more effective than raw power applied in bursts. Most of the county had forgotten by 1994 that a machine like that still existed on the Aldrin property. The world had moved on to hydraulics and electronics and machines of a scale that made the Caterpillar 20 look to anyone who had not seen it work like a piece of industrial archaeology rather than a functioning tool. Chester understood what it looked like to people who had not seen it work. He had never been particularly concerned with what things looked like. He turned away from the fence line on that 14th morning and went back to his own work. Now let me tell you about Bryce Mercer because you need to understand the man before you can understand why what happened mattered as much as it did. Bryce was 42 years old in the summer of 1994. He had been building things in central Missouri for 20 years, starting as a framing carpenter and working his way up through foreman and project manager to the point where he had started his own company a decade earlier and had grown it into the largest residential contractor in Callaway County. His projects were larger than his competitors, more expensive, better marketed, and more prominently featured in the regional real estate publications that people who bought $500,000 homes read. He drove a white Mercedes convertible with the company name painted on the doors. He wore designer clothes to job sites. He had a gift for the presentation of capability for making clients feel that what they were purchasing was not just a house, but a demonstration of what modern construction could achieve when the right people were in charge of it. His competitors called him the showman. His clients called him repeatedly because the showman delivered. The Deer Creek Estates project was the largest thing he had attempted. 50 homes on 5-acre lots, prices starting at $500,000, a gated entrance with a private lake, tennis courts, a clubhouse. The kind of development that gets your name mentioned in rooms where you have not yet been introduced. The entrance road was the first thing buyers would see, and Bryce had designed it to curve through a stand of mature trees in a way that communicated money and nature and the particular fantasy of both existing simultaneously. The old oak had stood in the center of the planned road. Removing it had been a straightforward matter of cost and logistics, and the tree itself had come down cleanly enough. What remained was the stump which had not come down at all, and which was now in the path of everything Bryce Mercer had been building toward. He had brought in the excavator on a Saturday morning 2 weeks before Chester stood at his fence line for the 14th time. Bryce had operated the machine himself that first day, which was something experienced operators would have noted and characterized as a warning sign, because the decision to demonstrate capability in front of your crew by personally operating a $400,000 piece of equipment on a job that was more complicated than it appeared was the kind of decision that people with something to prove made when what they should have been doing was thinking carefully about what they were attempting. Bryce positioned the excavator, extended the boom, wrapped the bucket around the base of the stump, and engaged the hydraulics. The machine groaned. The tracks dug into the clay. The engine ran hard. The stump did not move. He pushed harder. The hydraulic pressure built. The lines began to whine in the specific way that hydraulic lines whine when pressure is approaching the threshold beyond which the line itself becomes the weakest point in the system. The first hose blew at 3:47 in the afternoon. The sound was like a rifle shot. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the machine, across the stump, across Bryce Mercer's designer jeans. The excavator arm went limp against the stump, and the stump remained exactly where it had been when the morning started. Bryce had ordered the spare hoses brought out and the machine repaired. Then he had tried again. The second hose blew. He had it fixed and tried a third time. The third hose blew. That had been the end of the first week. The second week had involved a pair of D8 bulldozers chained to the excavator from different angles, pushing and pulling simultaneously, which had produced a great deal of noise and churned the surrounding soil into something that looked like the aftermath of an artillery exercise and had moved the stump approximately no distance at all. The bulldozer tracks had spun on the Missouri clay, while the excavator strained, and then another hose had blown, and by that point Bryce had spent $30,000 in equipment repairs and delays, and the stump had not moved one measurable inch. The winch system had come next, brought in from Des Moines by a recovery company that specialized in heavy equipment extraction. And the winch had strained, and the cable had stretched, and the anchor had pulled free of the ground, and the stump had responded by settling slightly deeper, as if it had considered the various forces being applied to it, and had decided they were not worth acknowledging. The crane operator who was called on the 14th morning had taken one look at the ground around the stump and the equipment that had already failed and had declined to bring his machine within 100 feet of any of it. He said he was not stupid enough to add another large machine to the collection of things that were stuck or broken within range of that stump. Bryce had said some things to the crane operator after he left that his site foreman Dean Pruitt had pretended not to hear. That was the situation on the morning of the 14th day when Chester Aldrin had stood at his fence line and looked at the stump one more time and decided that the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. Have you ever known the answer to a problem and had to wait for the person who needed that answer to exhaust every wrong approach first? Have you ever stood with the solution and watched someone apply everything except the solution, not because you wanted them to fail, but because you understood that a man who has not been proven wrong by his own effort will not accept the right answer from someone who seems to have no business providing it? That patience is one of the harder things. It is not passive. It is a specific and deliberate form of respect for the way that certain kinds of knowledge only become receivable after the recipient has been forced to acknowledge the limits of what he already has. Chester Aldrin had lived 71 years and had learned that lesson better than most. He went to his barn that afternoon. The Caterpillar 20 was where it always was, in the back corner of the machine shed, covered with a canvas that Chester lifted and folded and set aside the way he always did when he was preparing the machine for work. He did not hurry. There was no urgency in his movements, but there was also no inefficiency. He moved the way men move when they have performed the same sequence of tasks so many times that the sequence has become its own kind of intelligence. He walked around the machine first the way his father had always walked around it before using it, looking at the tracks and the sprockets and the steering clutches and the condition of the engine compartment, checking for anything that the monthly maintenance run might have missed. The machine had been started 3 weeks earlier. Everything looked as it should. Then he did something that was not part of the maintenance protocol. He put both hands flat on the hood of the engine the way you might put your hands on the back of an old horse before asking it for something difficult. The iron was cool in the morning shade of the machine shed. Chester could feel the faint texture of the paint through his palms, the paint that had started as orange and had faded through 62 years of Missouri weather and work to the color of dried clay. He stood there with his hands on the machine and let the question come, the question he had been not quite asking for the 2 weeks he had been watching from the fence line. The oak stump was not like the farm stumps he had pulled over the years. Those had been large, some of them, but nothing of that age, nothing with 3 centuries of root growth behind it. The machine had moved. Things had pulled things that should not have moved, had done the work it was built to do for 6 decades without catastrophic failure. But there was a difference between the confidence of familiarity and the certainty of knowledge, and Chester was honest enough with himself to recognize that what he had with this machine was familiarity. and that familiarity was not a guarantee. He thought about Emmett, not a specific memory, not one particular afternoon from the 45 years of watching his father work, but the accumulated presence of the man, the way certain people remain available to you after they are gone, a quality of attention rather than a voice, a way of considering problems that was not quite memory and not quite thought, but something that lived between the two. Emmett had stood at the drawbar of this machine on mornings like this one, had put his hands on it, had asked it for things that seemed unreasonable, and had received them not because the machine was magical or exceptional, but because the application had been correct, the rigging had been right, the patience had been there. Emmett used to say that the Caterpillar 20 did not know how to quit. He said it without pride, the way you say a fact. And then he said that this was not a flaw. It was the whole point. Chester lifted his hands from the hood and turned toward the trailer where his chains and pulleys were stored. He did not have certainty. What he had was analysis, and the analysis was clear enough to act on. The stump was not held by one force. It was held by thousands of forces, each root anchored at a different depth and angle, each one representing a discrete connection between the mass above ground and the earth below. You could not fight all of those forces at once. The mathematics of hydraulic pressure applied in a single direction would always be insufficient because you were asking one vector to overcome many simultaneously. What you could do if you understood the problem correctly and had the right equipment and enough patience was defeat those forces one at a time. That was what the Caterpillar 20 was for, not the horsepower which was modest. The mechanical advantage of the pulley system, combined with the machine's capacity for sustained, uninterrupted pulling force. A hydraulic machine builds to peak pressure, reaches its limit, and either succeeds or fails. The Caterpillar 20 did not have a pressure limit in the same sense. It simply pulled steadily constantly without the system cycling up and down, without a sensor deciding that the load was too great and cutting the power to protect itself. It just kept going until something gave. His father had understood that, had understood it in 1932, and had built a lifetime of work around the application of it. Chester loaded the trailer with chains of 3 different thicknesses, a block and tackle system he had been using for 30 years. Steel stakes for anchor points, wooden blocking for the pulleys and the heavy chain with links the size of a man's fist that Emmett had bought in 1941 and that Chester had never needed to replace. He hooked the trailer to the Caterpillar 20, started the engine, and pulled out of the machine shed into the July morning. The engine coughed twice on startup the way it always did, and then settled into the rhythm that Chester had been hearing since before he was old enough to understand what he was hearing. A sound that was not smooth the way modern engines were smooth, but was consistent, dependable, the sound of simple mechanics doing exactly what they had been designed to do. He drove along the property line toward the access road that connected his farm to the Deer Creek Estates site, moving at the pace the machine set, which was the pace of a man who has nowhere urgent to be and nothing to prove about how quickly he gets there. The morning was warm and clear, the kind of July morning in Missouri that starts well before it begins to tax you, and across the fence line Chester could see the construction site already in motion. The crew arranged around the stump and the collection of damaged equipment in the particular configuration of men who are doing something because the alternative is standing still and looking at a problem they cannot solve. He heard one of the workers say something when the sound of the Caterpillar 20's engine carried over the fence line. He saw heads turn. He kept moving. At the entrance to the access road, Chester turned and drove the crawler onto the construction site. Bryce Mercer was standing with Dean Pruitt near the stump when the machine came through. Bryce watched it approach with an expression that moved through confusion and contempt before settling on something that was mostly contempt. The expression of a man for whom the appearance of things was important, and who had just seen something appear on his job site that he found incompatible with the image he was trying to maintain. He said to Dean, "What is that?" Dean said, "That is Chester Aldrin's tractor. He farms the property next door." Bryce said, "It looks like it belongs in a museum." Dean said, "It's old. Chester keeps it running." Bryce said, "I don't care what he does with it. This is a closed construction site." But before anyone could move to intercept the crawler, Chester had already stopped it at the edge of the work area. He climbed down with the deliberate care of a man of 71 years, who had been climbing down from that particular machine for longer than most of the crew had been alive. He walked toward Bryce with the unhurried bearing of a man who had nothing to demonstrate and no performance to give. He said, "Morning." Bryce crossed his arms. He said, "Site is closed." Chester said, "I am not a visitor." He looked toward the stump. "Saw you've been having some trouble." Bryce said, "We've got it handled." Chester looked at the excavator with its arm still hanging limp from the last hose failure, and at the churned earth around the stump that was the evidence of two bulldozers trying to do something they were not designed for, and at the stump itself unchanged after 14 days and $30,000, and the combined mechanical effort of more horsepower than most small countries owned in 1932. He said, "Looks like it." There was a silence. Bryce said, "Is there something you wanted?" Chester said, "Thought I might be able to help. I've pulled a few stumps in my time." What came out of Bryce Mercer then started as a laugh and became something longer and louder, the laugh of a man who has just been presented with something so far outside his frame of reference that the only available response is laughter. He turned to Dean Pruitt and to the crew members who had stopped working to watch, and he repeated what Chester had said, his voice carrying across the site. Then he looked back at Chester's machine and at Chester. He said, "That thing weighs what? 5,000 pounds. 2.5 tons. Chester said about that. Bryce said, "My excavator weighs 40 tons. My bulldozers weigh 30 each. Between them, they couldn't move that stump an inch." He gestured at the Caterpillar 20 with the expression of a man who has already concluded the conversation. "And you think your antique toy is going to do what my 500,000 in equipment couldn't?" Chester did not respond to the laugh or to the word toy or to the word antique. He had heard all of those things in various forms, from various people over the years, and had found them as interesting the 100th time as the first, which was not very interesting at all. He said, "Your machines are stronger than mine." "That is true." He said, "But strength is not the problem." Bryce's laughter had wound down to something shorter and more impatient. He said then, "What is the problem?" Chester said, "Application. You are trying to pull that stump out all at once. Hydraulics push and pull in straight lines. They build pressure, reach a limit, and either something moves or something breaks. That stump is not held by one force. It is held by thousands of roots, each one anchored in a different direction. You cannot defeat all of them at once. You have to defeat them one at a time," Bryce said, "and how do you propose to do that?" Chester said, "Mechanical advantage, pulleys, patience." He walked back to his trailer and began unloading chains. Bryce watched him for a moment, then looked at Dean, who had been listening to the exchange with the expression of a man who was trying to calculate probabilities and was not quite satisfied with the results. Bryce said, "This is ridiculous." Dean said, "Maybe. But we've been trying for 2 weeks and the stump hasn't moved, Bryce said, because we blew hoses and had to repair. Dean said we blew hoses because the machine reached its pressure limit. The stump didn't move the stump. Bryce looked at Chester unloading chains with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this particular task many times. He said, "Fine. Let the old man embarrass himself. When that thing breaks down halfway through, he hauls it off himself." Dean said nothing. Chester, for his part, had not heard this exchange and would not have found it particularly relevant if he had. He had already dismissed the possibility of Bryce Mercer's opinion affecting what he was about to do, not from arrogance, but from the same clear-eyed practicality that had kept him at his fence line for 14 days rather than coming over on the first morning. He was here now because the moment was right and the problem was real and he had the equipment and the knowledge to address it, and the opinions of the man in the designer clothes would be answered not by argument, but by the weight of the stump coming out of the ground. He began setting up his equipment, and the morning moved around him, and the stump sat in the Missouri clay and waited the way it had been waiting for 300 years, patient in the way that things patient with no need to hurry. Chester was patient in exactly the same way. Chester spent the first hour doing nothing that looked like work. He walked around the stump in a wide circle, moving slowly, stopping at intervals to crouch down and examine the exposed root structure at ground level. He pressed a steel rod into the earth at various distances from the center, testing the soil resistance, gauging the depth and direction of the root system below the surface. Occasionally he stood still with his hands in his pockets and looked at the stump from a particular angle for a long time, the way a man looks at something when the looking itself is a form of calculation. The construction crew watched him with the particular attention of men who have been given permission to observe something they expect to fail. Bryce Mercer had retreated to his Mercedes by the time Chester was 10 minutes into his examination. The white car was parked under a stand of trees at the edge of the site, and through the tinted windows Chester could see the shape of a man with a phone to his ear, maintaining the posture of someone whose time was more valuable than what was happening outside the glass. Dean Pruitt stayed where he was standing near the stump with his arms at his sides, watching Chester work with the different kind of attention, the attention of a man who knew machinery and understood that what was being done right now was not preliminary to the work, but was itself the work, the part that determined whether everything after it would succeed or fail. Chester did not acknowledge Dean's presence except to occasionally point at a root section or a piece of ground and say a word or two that Dean would not have heard clearly at that distance even if he had been trying to hear it. Chester was not talking to Dean. He was talking to himself, narrating the process of understanding in the low, quiet way that men talk, when the talking is a way of making the thinking visible. What Chester was reading in the exposed root structure and in the resistance of the steel rod pressed into the soil was a map, not a drawn map and not a perfect map, but a working approximation of what lay beneath the surface, where the major roots ran, how deep they went, at what point they transitioned from the thick primary roots that anchored the stump directly to the smaller secondary roots that spread outward like a network of cables. The pulling strategy depended entirely on this map. Get it wrong and you would apply force in the wrong sequence, break the wrong things in the wrong order, and find yourself with a stump that was damaged but still immovable, which was worse than where you had started. Get it right, and the stump would come apart like a puzzle worked from the outside, in each piece removed in the order that made the next piece accessible. Chester had done this enough times to know the difference between the two outcomes before the pulling began. The hour of walking was not wasted time, it was the work. When he was satisfied, he went to the trailer and began unloading in earnest. The block and tackle system came off first. Chester had built this rigging over decades, adding pieces and replacing worn components as needed, until what he had was a set of 6 pulleys of varying sizes and strengths that he could configure in different arrangements depending on what the job required. The principle was simple. Each pulley in the system reduced the force required to move a given load by half. 6 pulleys properly arranged meant that 1 pound of force from the crawler translated to 6 pounds of force at the attachment point. The Caterpillar 20 produced 25 horsepower at the drawbar, which was a modest number by any modern standard. With the pulley arrangement Chester had in mind for the north side of this stump, that modest number became at the point where the chain met the root, effectively 150 horsepower of steady, uninterrupted pulling force. Not as much as the excavator, not even close, but applied differently, applied without the cycling pressure that blew hoses, applied in a direction chosen for maximum effect on the specific route being targeted, rather than in a single direction that distributed the force across the entire root system and overwhelmed nothing. Chester drove steel anchor stakes into the ground at positions he had selected during his examination of the site, positions that corresponded to the angles he needed for the pulley system to apply force correctly to each section of the root structure. He drove them deep the way his father had taught him, deep enough that the anchor would not pull free when the load came on, because a pulled anchor in the middle of a job was worse than not starting. He ran chains from the anchor stakes to the stump, threading them through the pulleys in the sequence that would give him the mechanical advantage he needed. He attached each chain to a specific root or root section, rather than wrapping the whole stump in a single loop, because single loop pulling was what the excavator had been doing, and he had watched the excavator do it for 2 weeks and knew exactly how useful that approach was. When he was finished, the stump was wearing a web of chains and cables, each one running to a pulley, each pulley angled to apply force in a specific direction that corresponded to the internal structure of the root system below the surface. Dean Pruitt had moved closer during the setup, not intrusively but steadily, until he was standing about 20 feet away and could see the details of the rigging. He said, "You are not going to pull it all at once." Chester said, "No." Dean said, "You are going to work around it." Chester said, "The roots on the north side are shallower. I will start there. Pop those roots out one at a time. Then shift to the east side, then west. The south side last, because those roots go deepest and they will hold longest. By the time I get to the south side, the stump will not have anything left to anchor it." Dean looked at the web of chains and pulleys. He said, "How long?" Chester said, "If nothing breaks, 4 hours." Dean looked toward the Mercedes where Bryce sat with his phone. He said, "Marcus has been at this for 2 weeks. Chester said he has been fighting the whole stump at once. I am going to take it apart piece by piece." Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand the principle. I am not sure I believe it will work on something this size." Chester said, "You are about to find out." He walked back to the Caterpillar 20. Now let me stop here for a moment, because before Chester climbed into the operator seat and began the process that was either going to vindicate 62 years of machine maintenance or leave him standing in front of a construction crew with a broken piece of antique equipment and a stump that had not moved, there was something that happened that most people who tell this story do not tell. Not because they are omitting it deliberately, but because Chester did not tell it to anyone while he was alive, and it was only Robert who understood it enough to include it in the later tellings. Chester stood beside the crawler for a moment before he climbed up. He put his hands on the hood again, the same position he had been in that morning in his machine shed, palms flat on the faded orange iron, feeling the engine warmth from the short drive over from the farm. He was 71 years old. He had maintained this machine for 27 years since his father died, started it every month, without exception, used it for the jobs it was suited for, kept it in the condition that Emmett would have kept it in. He had done all of that, but he had not pulled a stump of this size with this root system, in conditions this public and this consequential. The question that had been with him since his machine shed that morning was still there. It had not been answered by the hour of examination, or by the rigging setup, or by the explanation he had given to Dean Pruitt. It was the honest question underneath all of that, the one that experience and knowledge could not fully resolve in advance of the attempt. What if it was not enough? Not the machine, not the rigging, not the understanding of the root system. What if this particular stump, this 300-year-old anchor of clay and root and time, was simply more than the combination of 25 horsepower and 62 years of iron could address, regardless of how intelligently it was applied? Chester stayed with that question for a few seconds. He did not try to answer it. He let it be there, real and specific, and without a guaranteed response, because pretending it was not real would not have made the attempt more likely to succeed and would have been dishonest, and Chester Aldrin had very limited patience for dishonesty, including the self-directed variety. Then he thought about Emmett. Emmett had stood at this machine on mornings when the question was just as real, had stood at stumps that were too big loads that should not have moved work that the equipment was theoretically incapable of. And Emmett had said the same thing every time in different words but with the same meaning. He said the machine does not know when to quit. That is not a flaw. That is the whole point. And what that meant, what Chester understood it to mean now, in a way he had perhaps not fully understood it when he was young, was that the machine's ignorance of its own limits was a feature rather than a defect, because there were problems in the world that a machine with proper sensors and appropriate cutoffs and programmed limits would never solve, because it would decide they were unsolvable before the pulling had gone on long enough for the roots to give up one at a time. Chester was going to go on long enough. He climbed into the operator's seat. Have you ever watched someone begin a task that everyone around them expected to fail and felt the air change as they began? Not because of anything dramatic, not because of any announcement or display, but simply because of the quality of the attention the person brought to what they were doing, the specific gravity of someone who is not performing confidence but is operating from a place so far below performance that the word does not apply. That quality is recognizable. It is one of the things that separates the men who have done a thing from the men who believe they can do a thing, and the difference is not always visible from a distance, but it becomes visible quickly once the work begins. The construction crew, which had been watching with the skeptical amusement of men who had been given a reason to take a break from their own work and witness something that would make for a good story either way, felt that quality shift when Chester settled into the operator's seat. They did not stop watching, but the amusement changed its texture. Chester engaged the clutch and let the machine begin to move forward, taking up the slack in the first chain, the one connected to the anchor point on the north side, and threaded through the first pulley arrangement to the shallowest root section on that side of the stump. He did this at the same unhurried pace he had done everything else that morning, moving forward until the chain went from lying on the ground to describing a straight line between the drawbar and the pulley, and from the pulley to the stump. The chain went taut. The pulleys took the load. Chester could feel it through the seat and through the steering levers, the resistance coming up through the machine, the way resistance always comes up as a change in the quality of the engine's work, a different note in the exhaust. He kept moving forward. For a long moment nothing visible happened. Under the surface of the Missouri clay, 20 feet from where Chester sat, a root that had been growing since the 18th century was experiencing something it had never experienced before. Not a single large force applied to it from one direction which it had been designed by 300 years of growth to withstand, but a steady, patient force applied from an angle that corresponded to the direction the root was least designed to resist. A hydraulic machine would have applied its maximum pressure at the beginning of the pull, found the resistance greater than the threshold, and either blown a hose or waited for the operator to back off and try a different approach. Chester's machine applied its force, gradually building through the mechanical advantage of the pulley system, not in a burst, but in a sustained increase that the root could feel as a continuous demand rather than a single shock. The root resisted. Chester kept pulling. 30 seconds, a minute. The engine note held steady. The chain held its line. Nothing on the surface had changed. Then Chester felt it. A slight relaxation in the resistance, brief, and easily missed the specific sensation of something underground shifting position by a fraction of an inch. He knew that feeling. He had felt it on smaller roots many times. It meant the first fractures were forming in the soil around the root, the clay giving up its grip in the specific way it gives up grip when the force has been applied long enough in the right direction. He held the throttle where it was. 2 minutes. The engine coughed once and recovered. The chain remained taut. Then from under the ground on the north side of the stump there came a sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not the crack of a rifle or the boom of something structural giving way. It was a deep, low, organic sound, the sound of something that had been holding for a very long time, finally deciding to stop. A sound like a massive joint being released, like a fist unclenching after years of gripping. The soil on the north side of the stump heaved slightly. A crack appeared in the clay surface running from the stump outward in the direction Chester had been pulling, and the chain moved. Not much, perhaps 6 inches of travel, but it moved. The construction crew went completely quiet. Chester disengaged the clutch. He did not celebrate. He did not look back at the crew or toward the Mercedes or at Dean Pruitt. He climbed down from the machine, walked to the attachment point, repositioned the chain to the next section of route on the north side, ran it through the pulley arrangement again, and climbed back up. He engaged the clutch and began pulling again. The second route took less time than the first. Chester had adjusted the angle slightly based on what the first pull had told him about the soil structure, and the adjustment was correct. A minute and 45 seconds. Then the same sound, the same heave in the clay, the same increment of chain travel. He repositioned again. A third route. A fourth. The crew had stopped pretending to work on other parts of the site. They were standing in a rough semicircle at a respectful distance from the pull line, the way men stand when they are watching something they did not expect to find interesting, and have found instead that they cannot look away. Dean Pruitt had moved to a position where he could see both the attachment points on the stump and the crawler at the other end of the chain system. and he was doing the kind of watching that involved his whole attention, the watching of a man who is trying to understand a mechanism well enough to be able to explain it to someone else afterward. The Mercedes had not moved, but Chester noticed on his third repositioning that the shape visible through the tinted glass was no longer in the same position it had been. Bryce Mercer was sitting forward in the driver's seat, now facing the stump rather than the phone. Chester noticed this and returned to the work. What made this watching different from the watching of the previous 2 weeks was the accumulation of evidence. Each pulled root was a small fact. Each small fact was a contradiction of the conclusion that had seemed so obvious that this stump was not going to move. The contradiction was not yet large enough to have rebuilt the crew's expectations, but it was building. 5 small facts. 6. 7. Each one a root that had yielded to 25 horsepower applied correctly, a root that had not yielded to the combined hydraulic power of 70 tons of modern construction equipment applied incorrectly. Have you ever felt a room change around you? Not because of a dramatic event, not because of an announcement or a revelation, but because of the quiet accumulation of small facts that eventually add up to something the room was not expecting to need to account for. That is how this change happened on that construction site on that July morning, not all at once, in the specific way that certainty yields to evidence when the evidence is patient enough to keep presenting itself. By the time Chester had worked his way around to the east side of the stump, Bryce Mercer had gotten out of his Mercedes. He was standing at the edge of the work area, arms still crossed, face still arranged in the expression of a man who has not yet decided whether what he is seeing requires him to revise something important. But he was watching. He was watching with his whole attention in a way he had not been watching 2 hours earlier. Dean Pruitt moved to stand beside him. Dean said he is not pulling the stump, he is pulling the roots, each one separately. Bryce said it is still the same stump. Dean said it is not the same problem. Your excavator was trying to lift the whole mass at once. He is removing the anchors one at a time. By the time he gets to the last ones, the stump will not have anything left to hold it. Bryce said my excavator makes 10 times the horsepower. Dean said quietly, he is not using horsepower the same way. Bryce was silent for a moment. He watched Chester reposition the chain on the east side, watched him drive the anchor stake into the new position, watched him thread the chain through the pulley and climb back onto the machine with the same deliberate efficiency he had shown throughout. Bryce said it is the pulleys. Dean said the pulleys multiply the force. But that is not the whole reason. The reason is the angle and the sequence. He is reading the root system and pulling each piece in the direction it is least able to resist. It is leverage, but it is also just thinking correctly about the problem before you try to solve it. Bryce said something under his breath that Dean did not quite catch. Dean said your excavator is very good at what it is designed for. Lifting, digging, moving loose material. It was not designed for this specific task. That machine over there was designed for this specific task. Nothing else, just this. Bryce looked at the Caterpillar 20 at the faded orange paint and the steel tracks and the simple exposed operator platform with no cab, no air conditioning, no electronic systems of any kind. Then he looked at his excavator still sitting with its arm limp from the last hose. Failure 40 tons of modern machinery that had been beaten by a problem that a 62-year-old 5,000-pound crawler was currently in the process of solving. He said nothing. Chester had reached the point in his circuit of the stump where its visible lean was becoming apparent. What had been a perfectly upright mass of wood and clay for the entire 2 weeks of the struggle was now tilted, not dramatically, perhaps 10 or 15 degrees, but tilted in a way that was unmistakable once you were looking for it, tilted in the direction of the north and east, pulling the direction where the roots had been removed and the clay had closed up behind them, leaving nothing to anchor that side of the mass against the continued application of force. The crew saw it at the same time. Someone at the back of the gathered group said what everybody was thinking in a voice that came out smaller than a shout, but larger than normal, speaking a voice shaped by the need to release something that was building in the chest. He said, "It is moving." It was not a question, it was the announcement of a fact that had just become undeniable offered to the group because facts of that quality feel like they need to be spoken aloud before they can be fully accepted. Chester did not hear it, or if he heard it, he did not mark it in any visible way. He was on the west side now, repositioning for the next sequence. He drove the stake, ran the chain, checked the angle, climbed back up. The engine engaged, the chain went taut. 3 more roots on the west side. The lean increased to 20 degrees, then 25. The stump was not breaking free. Not yet. The deepest roots on the south side were still holding, and those roots had been growing for 3 centuries in soil that had compacted around them the way soil compacts when it has been undisturbed for a very long time. But the other 3 sides of the anchor system were gone, and what had been an immovable object because it was anchored in every direction, was now an object anchored in one direction, which was a different situation entirely. Bryce Mercer was no longer standing with his arms crossed. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his mouth slightly open, watching a 71-year-old man on a 62-year-old machine do something that $30,000 in modern equipment over 2 weeks had not done, and he was watching it with the specific expression of a man who has not yet processed what the evidence in front of him means for certain things he had been confident about for most of his adult life. Dean Pruitt said nothing. He had been a site foreman long enough to know that the moment when a man's certainty is cracking is not the moment to add commentary. Chester shut down the machine. He climbed down and walked to the stump and spent several minutes examining its current position, kicking at the exposed roots on the south side with his boot, pushing a rod into the clay to check what the remaining anchors looked like below the surface. He went back to his trailer and removed the heaviest chain, the one with links the size of a man's fist, that Emmett had bought in 1941, the chain that Chester had never needed to replace because Emmett had bought it heavy enough to outlast both of them. He wrapped this chain around the center of the stump, not a section or a root, but the main mass itself, the 300-year-old heartwood that sat at the center of everything that had been holding the stump in the earth for longer than the state of Missouri had been a state. He ran it through the final pulley arrangement, the heaviest configuration in his system, and connected it to the drawbar of the Caterpillar 20. He stood at the stump for a moment, checking the chain wrap, making sure the attachment was where it needed to be. Then he walked to the crawler and climbed back up. The crew had gone completely silent. There was no more conversation on the site, no sounds of equipment operating elsewhere, no radio noise, nothing. 50 people who had started the morning with very specific expectations about what this old man and his old machine were capable of were standing in a silence that had been produced by the accumulated weight of the evidence of the last 4 hours. Chester put his hands on the controls. He checked the engine temperature. He looked down the length of the chain toward the stump one time, confirming the line was clear and the angle was right. Then he engaged the clutch and pushed the throttle forward. Not gently, not the measured incremental approach he had used on the individual routes. This was the main pull, the final application of everything the machine could produce through everything the pulley system could multiply, applied to the center mass of a 300-year-old oak stump that had surrendered its north and east and west anchors and had nothing left to hold it in the earth except the deepest roots on the south side, and whatever instinct objects of great age and deep-rootedness have for remaining exactly where they are. The chain went tight, the pulleys loaded, the tracks dug into the Missouri clay, the steel cleats finding purchase the way they had been finding purchase since 1932. The engine sound changed, not louder but deeper, a register shift that came from the whole machine working at the edge of its capacity, not the comfortable range of routine pulling, but the outer territory where the design was being asked to show what the engineers had put into it. Chester held the throttle where it was. 1 minute the chain was vibrating, the stump had not moved. 90 seconds. The engine held its note, the tracks held their grip. The stump had not moved. 2 minutes. Chester could feel through the seat every vibration the machine was producing, could feel the difference between the machine working and the machine straining, and what he felt was the machine working at its limit, but not past it. The sustained, steady application of force that was the Caterpillar 20's specific and irreplaceable capability. Under the ground on the south side of the stump, the last anchors were receiving that force. Not in a burst, not in a shock. In the patient, uninterrupted way that wore down resistance, not by overpowering it, but by outlasting it, by being there when the root decided it had held long enough, by continuing to apply the demand at the moment the demand could finally be met. Chester felt the change before the stump moved. A fractional relaxation in the load, the faintest softening in the resistance coming back through the chain and the pulleys and the drawbar and the seat. He had felt this before on smaller stumps. He knew what it meant. He held the throttle where it was. And then from somewhere deep in the Missouri clay from the last 300 years of root growth that had been holding this particular piece of earth against this particular force, there came a sound like thunder generated underground. The stump rose, not slowly and not a little. The whole mass came up with a sound that had no adequate description, a tearing and a groaning, and something that vibrated in the chest of every person standing within 50 feet of it. 300 years of wood and root and clay erupting from the earth in a single motion, trailing dirt and rocks and severed roots like the emergence of something that had been buried far too long and was finally irrevocably free of the ground that had held it. The stump cleared the hole and rolled onto its side, and the construction site fell absolutely silent. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the construction crew came apart, not in the organized way of people who have planned a celebration, in the involuntary way of people who have been holding something in for a long time and have just been given permission to release it. Men were shouting things they would not remember shouting. 2 of the laborers near the back of the group were laughing the way men laugh when the tension breaks suddenly and the body does not know what to do with what is left. Someone near the equipment shed had climbed up on the blade of the dormant bulldozer and was pointing at the hole where the stump had been, and then at the stump itself, and then at the crawler, making the same pointing gesture repeatedly, as if needing to confirm that all 3 things were present and had the relationship to each other that he thought they had. Dean Pruitt stood where he had been standing and did not join the celebration immediately. He looked at the hole, which was perhaps 5 feet deep at its center and 15 feet across at the widest point, a crater of disturbed earth that represented everything the root system had been holding in place for 3 centuries. He looked at the stump lying on its side, exposing the ragged ends of roots that had been pulling the clay for longer than his grandfather's grandfather had been alive. He looked at the caterpillar, 20 still running, the engine settling back to its idle note. Now that the load had been released, the chain lying slack in the dirt, where the tension had gone out of it when the stump came free. Then Dean looked at Chester Aldrin. Chester had shut off the engine. He climbed down from the operator's seat in the same way he had climbed down every other time that morning, carefully taking his time with the footing, with no hurry and no particular expression on his face. He walked to the stump and looked at the hole for a moment. He nodded once to no one in particular, the nod of a man confirming to himself that what he expected to find is what he has found. Then he walked to the beginning of the chain run and started coiling. That was the thing Dean would talk about later when he told this story to his wife and to his children and to people he worked with on other projects over the following years. Not the pulling, which was remarkable. Not the physics of it, which he would come to understand better over time, and which he would explain patiently to anyone who wanted to understand it. The thing he talked about was the coiling. Chester Aldrin had just done something that $30,000 in modern equipment had failed to do over 2 weeks, had done it in front of 50 people who had been given specific reasons to expect him to fail, and his immediate response to the success was to walk to the end of his chain and begin putting his equipment away with the same unhurried thoroughness he had used to set it up. No acknowledgement of the crowd, no pause to receive what the crowd was offering. The work was done. The work that came after finishing was the putting away. Dean would say, when he told the story, I had been in construction for 15 years when that happened. I thought I had seen most of what there was to see in this business, but I had never seen a man treat his own achievement like it was just the next thing on the list. And I have never forgotten it. Bryce Mercer was standing at the edge of the crater. He had not moved when the stump came out. He had not moved during the 3 seconds of silence, or during the eruption of the crew, or during Chester's quiet walk to the coiling work. He stood at the edge of the hole with his hands at his sides, looking down into the earth that had held the stump for 3 centuries, and his face had the expression of a man who is doing internal arithmetic of a kind that is more complicated and more uncomfortable than the financial arithmetic he was accustomed to performing. He had laughed at this man in front of his whole crew loudly with the specific contempt of a man who has confused the appearance of capability with actual capability, who has looked at something old and small and assumed without examination that old and small meant inadequate. He had been wrong about that assumption in a way that was now documented in the physical evidence of the pulled stump, and the documentation was visible to everyone on the site, and there was no version of events in which Bryce Mercer was going to be able to describe what had happened this morning as anything other than what it was. Chester finished coiling the first chain and moved to the second. Bryce watched him for a moment, then he walked over. Chester did not stop working. He acknowledged Bryce's approach with a slight turn of his head, but kept his hands on the chain. Bryce said, "There is your hole." Chester said, "Should be able to pour your road now." Bryce was quiet for a moment. Chester kept coiling. The crew had settled from its initial eruption into a lower-grade ongoing noise, men talking, equipment starting up again in the farther parts of the site, the sound of a job site returning to its working rhythm after an interruption. Bryce said, "How?" Chester looked at him. Bryce said, I know what you told me about the pulleys and the angles. I understood the words, but I was still standing here expecting it not to work. How did you know it would work? Chester set down the coiled chain and straightened up. He looked at Bryce Mercer with the expression he used when he was about to say something that mattered and wanted to say it correctly. He said, same way my father knew. Because this machine was designed for exactly this kind of problem. Not for digging, not for lifting, for pulling things that do not want to move. And because I have been watching it do this work for 60 years, and I know what it can do when it is applied correctly. Bryce said your father, the one who bought it in the Depression, Chester said Emmett, 1932, he paid $800 for it. Used. In 1932, that was everything he had. Bryce said why. Chester considered the question. He said because he saw what it could do. He went to a demonstration somewhere I do not know exactly where, and he watched it work, and he understood that the things he needed to do on his land were exactly what this machine had been built for. And he made the decision that cost him everything he had saved because he was thinking about the next 20 years of work rather than the next 20 minutes of having money. There was a silence between them, not the hostile silence of the morning, but a different kind, the silence of two men who have finished one conversation and are at the beginning of another one. Bryce said, I laughed at you. In front of my whole crew. Chester said you did. Bryce said I called your machine junk. Chester said you did that too. Bryce said and you still came over and helped me. Chester looked at him evenly. He said I did not help you. I pulled a stump. You happened to need one pulled. Bryce was quiet for a moment. He said that is a distinction without much of a difference from where I am standing. Chester said it matters to me. He picked up the next coil of chain. I did not come over here to teach you a lesson. I did not come over here to show up your equipment or make your crew think less of you. I came over here because there was a stump that needed to come out and I had the equipment and the knowledge to take it out, and my father would have wanted me to use them when they were needed. Bryce said your father would have wanted you to help someone who laughed at you. Chester said he believed that if you could help someone, you helped them. It did not matter whether they deserved it. Deserving had nothing to do with it. The stump needed to come out, and I could take it out, and so I came over and took it out. That is as complicated as it gets. Bryce stood with that for a moment. He said, What do I owe you? Chester shook his head. He said nothing. Bryce said there has to be something. Name a price. Chester coiled the last chain and set it on the trailer. He turned and looked across the construction site at the stand of mature trees that Bryce had designed the entrance road to curve through the trees that were the first thing buyers would see when they came through the gates of Deer Creek Estates, the carefully maintained image of money and nature coexisting gracefully. He said you are building 50 houses out here, nice houses, people with money, people with education, people who do not know what this land was before they arrived. Bryce said, what about them? Chester said, put up a marker at the entrance, at the spot where that stump was. Stone or metal, something that will last. Put on it that this land was farmed by a family from before the Civil War until this year. That before the houses were built there were crops, that the people who worked this ground built it with their hands and their backs and their patience. He paused. Something that reminds the people driving through that gate that they are living on land that was already something before it became what it is now. Bryce looked at him. He said, why? Chester said, because my father would have wanted that too. He looked at Bryce steadily. Because the land remembers what it was even when the people on it have forgotten. Bryce was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I can do that." Chester said, "Then we are even." He climbed back onto the Caterpillar 20, started the engine, and drove it toward the access road that led back to his farm. The steel tracks made their familiar sound against the Missouri earth. The exhaust coughed and settled, and Chester did not look back at the crew or at Bryce Mercer or at the hole where the stump had been. He drove at the pace the machine set, which was the pace the machine had always set, and the sound of it carried across the construction site and then faded as he moved down the access road and back onto his own property. Now let me tell you about what came after, because the story does not end with a pulled stump. Bryce Mercer finished the Deer Creek Estates development 6 months later, on time and on budget, exactly as he had promised his buyers. The entrance road curved through the trees the way he had designed it, and people who drove through the gate saw exactly the impression he had intended, the graceful marriage of money and nature that was the signature of his best work. At the entrance, at the place where the root system of the old oak had gripped the Missouri clay for 3 centuries, Bryce had a stone marker installed. It was not a small or easily overlooked marker. It was 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, set in a concrete foundation with a bronze plaque face. The inscription read, "As he and Chester had agreed that the land had been farmed by a family for 147 years before the subdivision was built, that before the houses came, there were crops, that the people who worked the ground built it with their hands and their patience, and that their memory was honored here." The homeowners association, when the first residents moved in, voted to have the marker removed. They felt it was out of keeping with the character of the development. Bryce told them no. He told them it clearly and without apology, and he told them it was in the deed restrictions, which it was, because he had made sure of that before the first closing. He told them that marker was going to be there as long as any of the houses in Deer Creek Estates were standing, and that if any future board wanted to revisit the question, they were welcome to read the deed restrictions first. No future board revisited the question. On his desk in the Mercer construction office, Bryce kept a photograph. Chester had given it to him the following week when Bryce stopped by to confirm the details of the marker. A photograph of Emmett Aldrin standing beside the Caterpillar 20 in what Chester said was 1935, 3 years after Emmett bought the machine. Emmett looked like the photographs of men from that era always look, lean and weathered, wearing clothes that had been washed many times, and showed it standing with the posture of someone who has not thought about whether he is standing correctly, because he has been working since before the question occurred to him. The crawler behind him looked exactly as it would look 60 years later when his son drove it across a construction site in 1994. Orange paint faded to clay color, steel tracks, simple open operator platform. When people asked about the photograph, Bryce told the story. All of it, including the part where he had laughed, because that part was true, and leaving it out would have made the story smaller than it was. He would say, "I spent 20 years in this business believing that newer was better and bigger was more capable, and that you could solve any construction problem with sufficient horsepower and the right modern equipment. And then a 71-year-old farmer pulled out a stump with a machine that was already old when my father was in school, and he did it in 4 hours, when my $500,000 in equipment couldn't do it in 2 weeks. And the lesson was not that his machine was better than mine. It was not better than mine for most things. The lesson was that I had been applying the wrong tool to the problem because I had never learned to ask what the problem actually was before I started throwing equipment at it. I had been asking, how much force can I generate, when I should have been asking, what kind of force does this specific problem require? He started keeping simpler equipment in his yard, things that were designed for specific tasks, older things with straightforward mechanics that could be understood without a service manual 3 inches thick. He started hiring on some projects men who were old enough to remember doing things by different methods, not because the old methods were always better, but because men who knew the old methods were often better at understanding why the new methods did or did not apply to a given situation. And every time someone on one of his sites told him a problem was impossible, he thought of Chester Aldrin and the specific way Chester had looked at the stump for an hour before touching a single piece of equipment, and he said the same thing each time. Nothing is impossible. You have just not found the right approach yet. Chester Aldrin kept farming his 320 acres until 1998, when his knees finally made the decision that his will had been overriding for several years. His son Robert, who had been helping with the farm increasingly since the mid-90s, took over the operation, and Chester moved into a smaller role that involved more advice giving and less heavy lifting. He did not find this transition easy, but he found it easier than he expected, partly because the land was staying in the family, and partly because Robert had the same quality of attention to work that Emmett had had, and that Chester had spent his life trying to maintain. Chester kept the Caterpillar 20 in the same barn where Emmett had parked it after every job and where Chester had kept it for the 27 years since Emmett died. He started the engine once a month, as he always had, because a machine that is not kept running is not waiting, and Chester had no intention of letting this particular machine stop waiting. After the Stump incident, people who had heard the story began driving out to the Aldrin farm to see the crawler. Not many people at once, but a steady trickle, the kind of informal attention that accumulates around a story that keeps being told. Farmers who had heard about it at the feed store or the co-op. Contractors who had heard the story secondhand from people who knew Bryce Mercer. History enthusiasts who had an interest in working agricultural equipment from the early 20th century. Chester received them all the same way, without ceremony, showing them the machine, explaining what it was and what it had been designed for, and why it still worked for the things it had been designed for. He ended each telling the same way with what he said was something his father had told him, that people get confused about what makes machines powerful, that they think it is about horsepower and size and how much force you can generate, that this thinking is understandable but incomplete. That power is about applying force effectively, and that a lever is more powerful than a hammer, and a pulley is more powerful than a rope, and patience is more powerful than either of them. Chester Aldrin died in the summer of 2006. He was 83 years old. He had been sitting on his porch on a July evening, which was how he spent most of his evenings in the years after he stopped farming full time, and Robert found him there with his coffee cup on the arm of the chair and his hands folded in his lap, looking out toward the equipment shed where the Caterpillar 20 had been parked since Emmett put it there the first time. His funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Fulton, and the attendance was larger than anyone had expected, which was a reflection of how many people he had touched in 71 years of farming the same ground and doing the same work and maintaining the same quality of honest attention to everything he put his hands to. Bryce Mercer flew back from Arizona, where he had relocated his business operation, to attend the service. He sat in a pew near the back next to men he had known when he was building in Callaway County and had not seen in several years. After the service at the reception held in the church fellowship hall, he found Robert Aldrin and shook his hand for a long time without saying anything. Then he handed Robert an envelope. Robert opened it. Inside was a check. Robert looked at the amount and then at Bryce. Bryce said the money your father refused to take in 1994, plus what I calculate to be a reasonable interest over 12 years. He paused. Without your father, that stump would have cost me everything. Not just 30,000 in repairs and delays. The whole contract. Maybe the whole company. I was 2 months from a breach that would have ended Mercer Construction, and your father solved the problem in 4 hours and refused to take a dime for it. This does not cover what he did, but it is what I have to offer. Robert looked at the check again. He said, "This is $50,000. Bryce said yes. Robert was quiet for a moment. He said my father would not have known what to do with $50,000. Bryce said, "Then tell me what he would have wanted done with it." Robert thought about it. He said he always supported the County Historical Society. They preserve old farm equipment, they take machines that would otherwise be scrapped and they keep them running, and they teach young people about how things were done before everything became electronic. He paused. Send it there with a note that says it came from the Aldrin family and that it is to be used for the preservation and operation of working equipment, not display equipment, working equipment. Bryce sent the check the following week with the note Robert had described. The Historical Society used the money over the following several years to acquire and restore 3 additional pieces of early 20th century farm equipment that were in working condition to fund a series of demonstrations at the county fair that showed how these machines operated and what they had been built for, and to create an educational program for high school students in Callaway County that included hands-on operation of the restored equipment under supervision. They named the program the Aldrin Working History Initiative, which Chester would have found both gratifying and slightly embarrassing, and which Emmett would have found entirely appropriate. The Caterpillar 20 remained in Robert Aldrin's barn. Robert maintained it the way Chester had maintained it and the way Emmett had maintained it before that, starting it once a month without exception, keeping the engine fluid and the seals from setting, attending to what the machine needed with the consistent attention that had kept it operational for more than 70 years. He used it 2 or 3 times a year for jobs on the farm that nothing else handled quite as well. In the spring of 2015, Robert's daughter Emma turned 16. She had been going to the barn with Robert since she was old enough to be in the barn safely, and she had been asking about the crawler since she was old enough to ask complicated questions. On her birthday, Robert spent an afternoon teaching her to drive it, walking alongside the machine as it moved slowly around the equipment shed yard, explaining the steering clutches and the throttle and the way the tracks communicated the condition of the ground through the seat. Emma Aldrin learned to drive the Caterpillar 20 the year it turned 83 years old on the same property where Emmett Aldrin had parked it for the first time in 1932. In the same barn with the same tools on the same workbench and the same quality of attention that the machine had been receiving for the entire time it had been alive. That same spring on the outskirts of Fulton, a developer named Whit Mercer was building a new subdivision on property that had formerly been used for agricultural purposes. Whit was 41 years old and had inherited his father's company when Bryce semi-retired to Arizona, and he had his father's gift for residential development and his father's ambition, and as it would turn out, at least one of his father's blind spots. There was a stump, not as large as the oak that had stopped Bryce in 1994. An elm tree a century old with a trunk 4 feet across and a root system that spread 25 feet in every direction and had been growing undisturbed since before the First World War. It was right in the path of the main entrance road, which was the first thing buyers would see, and Whit needed it out before the road could be graded and paved. He brought in an excavator. The excavator was newer and more capable than the one his father had used in 1994. It had better hydraulics, a more powerful engine, an operator cab with climate control, and a digital monitoring system that provided real-time data on pressure and load and engine performance. It was a fine machine. On the third day, when the second hydraulic line had blown and the stump had not moved, Whit Mercer was standing in front of it with the same expression his father had worn in 1994, the expression of a man whose certainty has been replaced by something unfamiliar. His site foreman, a man who had worked in Callaway County construction for 20 years, said, "You know the story about your grandfather." Whit said, "My father, and I know the story." The foreman said, "Robert Aldrin still has that crawler." Whit said that was a different situation. The foreman was quiet. Whit looked at the stump, and then at the broken hydraulic line, and then at the schedule on his clipboard, which showed a grading window of 3 weeks before the weather made paving impossible until spring. He said, "Call Robert Aldrin." Robert Aldrin arrived the next morning on a machine that Whit had only ever seen in the photograph on his father's desk. Orange paint faded to clay color, steel tracks, open operator platform. 83 years old and starting on the third pull of the ignition cord, which was 3 pulls fewer than it had taken the first morning Chester brought it to the Deer Creek Estate site in 1994. Whit Mercer watched Robert climb down and walk around the elm stump, kneeling at the root structure, pressing a rod into the clay, doing the hour of looking that preceded the work. He called his father. Bryce answered on the second ring the way a man answers when he has been expecting a call for a while and knows what it is going to be about. Whit said, "Dad, I have a situation." Bryce said, "I know. Robert called me." Whit said, "He is here right now with that crawler, standing around the stump looking at it." There was a long silence on the line, not an empty silence. The silence of a man listening to a sound in the background of a phone call and recognizing it the way you recognize a sound that carries a specific weight of memory. Bryce said, "Is that the engine I hear?" Whit held the phone away from his face toward the Caterpillar 20, which Robert had just started and was letting warm up. Bryce said, "Yes, that is it." Whit said, "Dad, he is going to try to pull the stump with the machine from 1932. Bryce said, "Yes, he is." Whit said, "Our excavator makes 3 times the horsepower of that thing." Bryce was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was not the laugh he had used in 1994 when he stood on the Deer Creek Estate's construction site and pointed at Chester Aldrin's machine and said what he had said. That laugh had been contempt dressed up as amusement. This was different. This was the laugh of a man who has lived with a story long enough to find it genuinely funny. The laugh of a man who recognizes himself in his son's situation and finds the recognition more valuable than uncomfortable. He said, "Your excavator makes 3 times the horsepower. That is true. And the horsepower is not the problem." Whit said, "What is the problem?" Bryce said, "Application." He paused. "Make sure you watch. All of it. Do not go sit in your truck and check your phone while Robert works. Stand where you can see the chains and the pulleys and the attachment points and the way he reads the root system before he touches a chain. Watch it the way you would watch someone teach you something, because that is what is happening, even if nobody is calling it that." Whit said, "How long is it going to take?" Bryce said, "If nothing breaks, 2 or 3 hours for a stump that size." Whit said, "That is still faster than what I have been doing for 3 days." Bryce said, "Yes, it is considerably faster." There was a pause. Bryce said, "Whit." Whit said, "Yeah." Bryce said, "There is something else. When Robert is done and the stump is out, you are going to have an instinct to give him money and end the conversation and get back to your schedule." Whit said, "That is not an instinct. That is the correct professional response." Bryce said, "It is what I would have done before that summer. Listen to what he asks for instead. Whatever he asks for, say yes." Whit said, "Dad, I have a schedule." Bryce said, "Say yes. I am telling you that whatever Chester's son asks you to do in payment for Chester's machine doing what your equipment cannot do, say yes. And then do it the same way I did it, without argument and without modification, and for as long as the development exists." He paused. "Tell him about the marker at Deer Creek while you are at it. Tell him the homeowners association wanted it removed. Tell him I said no." Robert Aldrin pulled the elm stump out in 2 hours and 43 minutes. Whit Mercer stood and watched every minute of it as his father had instructed, watching the chains and the pulleys and the way Robert's attention moved between the machine and the root structure as the pulling proceeded. He watched the stump tilt. He watched the individual roots yield one at a time. He watched the final chain wrap go on, and he watched Robert settle into the operator seat for the main pull with the same quality of settled attention that the photograph on his father's desk showed in Emmett's posture in 1935. When the elm stump came out of the Missouri, Clay Whit Mercer did not try to match the crew's reaction. He just stood at the edge of the hole and looked at it for a while. Robert climbed down and walked over. He extended his hand. Whit shook it and said, "How?" Robert looked at him. He gave him the same answer his father had given Bryce Mercer in the same county 21 years earlier, with no modification and no addition, because it was the right answer, and right answers do not require improvement. He said, "Some problems do not need more power. They need better thinking." Whit was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do I owe you?" Robert told him. It was the same request Chester had made, a marker at the entrance to the new development, something that told the people who would live there what the land had been before it became what it was, something that remained when other things were removed, something that cost the developer a small amount of effort and lasted longer than the effort seemed to warrant. Whit said yes without hesitation or qualification, because his father had told him to, and because standing at the edge of that hole with the elm stump on its side and the chains being coiled by a man who was 67 years old and had just done what his 3 times more powerful equipment had not done in 3 days, saying yes seemed like the only response that made sense. He called his father on the way back to the site office. Bryce answered on the first ring. "Whit said you were right." Bryce said about the marker. Whit said about everything. He paused. "That machine is 83 years old. I watched it pull that stump in less than 3 hours. Our excavator has been at it since Tuesday." Bryce was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did Robert tell you about the first time? About Chester and your grandfather?" Whit said, "I know the story. You have told it 100 times." Bryce said knowing a story and watching it happen in front of you are not the same thing. Whit said no, they are not. There was a pause on the line. In the background, Whit could still hear the faint sound of the Caterpillar 20's engine as Robert drove it back toward his property, the steel tracks on the access road, the unhurried pace of a machine going home after finishing the work it had been built for. Bryce said Emmett Aldrin spent $800 he did not have in the worst economic year in American history on a machine that seemed unnecessary to everyone around him because he saw what it could do for the work that was actually in front of him. Chester kept that machine running for 60 years because he understood what his father had understood. Robert has kept it running for 20 more years because he understands what his father understood. And Emma Aldrin is learning to drive it right now because Robert understands what comes after understanding. He paused. He said, "You are going to have problems in this business that your equipment cannot solve. Problems where someone is going to tell you that the job is impossible and that you need to accept that and find a way around it. When that happens, I want you to remember what you saw today. Not the machine specifically. The principle that the right tool and the right thinking applied correctly will do what the wrong tool and the wrong thinking cannot do, regardless of how much they cost or how new they are." Whit said, "I will remember." Bryce said, "Good." There was one more silence, the comfortable silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and are not filling the space with things that do not need to be said. Then Bryce said, "Tell me about the stump. How big was it?" And Whit told him the way you tell someone a story when you have just been inside it and it has not yet become the kind of story you tell from the outside with all the details sharp and present. The clay on the ground and the chain going tight and the specific sound from underground. When the last roots gave up and the century-old elm came free of the earth that had been holding it since before either of their grandfathers were born. The Caterpillar 20 is still in the Aldrin family barn. It gets started once a month. It has been started once a month for over 90 years now, first by Emmett, then by Chester, then by Robert, and now also by Emma, who learned to drive it on her 16th birthday, and who has the same quality of attention to the machine that her great-grandfather had, and her grandfather had, and her father has the specific attention that comes from understanding that you are the current custodian of something that was here before you and will be here after you, and that what happens in between depends on whether you do what needs to be done. The stump pulling story has been told in Callaway County for 30 years now. The details change with the telling. The stump gets larger. The excavator gets more expensive. The time Chester took gets shorter. But the lesson stays exactly the same in every version, because it is the kind of lesson that does not change in the translation, the kind that arrives complete and remains complete regardless of what the telling adds or subtracts. Expensive does not mean better. New does not mean smarter. Sometimes the right tool is the one that was designed 60 years ago for exactly the problem you are facing, maintained faithfully through decades of disuse, driven across a fence line by a man who waited until the moment was right and then did the work without making a production of doing it. Somewhere in a barn in central Missouri, there is a 92-year-old crawler tractor that still starts, still runs, still does the work it was built to do. It is waiting for the next stump, the next problem that throws money at itself and breaks its equipment and runs out of modern answers. It will be there when that problem arrives because the people who have it understand that some machines are not just machines. They are the accumulated knowledge of the people who built them and the people who learn to use them. and the people who kept them running through all the years when they were not needed against the day when they would be needed again. Some problems do not need more power, they need better thinking, and the machine built for stubborn is still waiting for the people who are ready to understand that.